Welcome to Disrupted Science, the occasional conversation between the authors of the upcoming book, How the Internet Disrupted Science. I'm Kent Anderson here with my co-author, Joy Moore, and we're recording this on Wednesday, August 20th, 2025. Hey, Joy.
Hey, Kent.
All right, we're going to get our tagline down. Um, so it's good. It's a cool episode. It's our first interview. We're going to talk to Jason Steinhauer, author of History Disrupted. So are you excited for that?
Yes, I love the book. It is really well written, and it's just enough in the past that things are still fresh, but it's
Hmm.
also what, 3 years old.
Yeah,
Um,
3 or 4. Yeah.
and it's aged well. And
Yes.
so I think a lot of the things, meaning that a lot of the things that he describes and the problems and opportunities that he discusses in the book have yet to be resolved. Um,
Right. And some of them are even more obvious, I'd say.
yeah.
Yeah. So he was
And it's also
a good early warning system in a way.
right. And similar to the interview that we heard with the two authors of the AI Con, who were
Mm.
saying a year after their book came out, a year after they turned it in. Same thing with this one. It's been a couple of years since he published it, and it's still as relevant, if not more relevant than it was at the time. So I think that's going to bode pretty well for us too. Um,
Yeah. Fingers crossed. All right.
mhm.
Well, let's go straight to the interview, and then we'll wrap up with some discoveries of the week. So here, if all goes well, is our interview with Jason Steinhauer. We're pleased to be joined today by our first interview on the podcast, Jason Steinhauer, a public historian working at the intersection of history, tech, media, and politics. He writes and speaks about how social media, tech, and AI are shaping our history, politics, democracy, and future. His 2021 book, History Disrupted, caught our eye after our book was completed, but it was heartening to see him hit on some of the same main themes and concerns, but in the field of history. We're excited to speak with him today, so welcome to Disrupted Science, Jason.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
Welcome.
So you make a distinction in your book that right off the bat between history and what you call e-history. Can you explain that, elaborate on that for the listeners?
Yeah, I can. First of all, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me. Pleased to meet fellow disruptors. Um, it's a little complicated, so let me try to explain it concisely without going on for too long. Um, Probably the first distinction that would be useful to think about would be the distinction between history and the past. So, and this is not settled science. There's a lot of debate within the history profession that has been going on for decades around these terms and these questions. But sort of how I think about it, a minute ago, when you introduced me on the podcast, that was the past. When you sent me an email asking me to be on the podcast, that was the past. When you decided to write your book, that event happened in the past. When my book was published, that event happened in the past. So the past has this sort of infinite number of events that have transpired before what we call the present. History is the analysis and interpretation of that past, right? So it's fine to say that Jason Steinhauer wrote a book or that Kent and Joy are writing a book, but then historians like to ask the question of, okay, what does that mean? What does it mean that they're writing a book? Why are they writing the book in 2025 as opposed to 2021? How do we interpret their writing the book in the broader context of what's happening in society or what's happening in science or what's happening in their own careers? So it's these types of questions that historians think about, and historians sometimes think about them in relatively straightforward, simple manners. So, why did the colonies succeed in winning the war for independence? Why did the Union win the Civil War? These are sort of more basic historical questions that listeners may be familiar with, but then sometimes these get very complex and theoretical. You're
Mhm.
talking about decolonial studies or decolonization studies or areas like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so um, the past and history connected, but not always the same thing. Um, Now, when it comes to the internet and social media and the devices that we use every day, there's this question about how do you translate the past slash history into content that can perform well on social media. And when you look at history YouTube videos or history Twitter threads or X threads, whatever they're called now,
Hmm.
Instagram channels, etc., what they're really doing, I argue in the book, and I've argued since, is that they're taking a small sliver of the past or a small sliver of history, and they're condensing it into a media format and then sort of squishing it onto the social web in whatever platform makes sense for them. Um, and of course, the past is a very big place, so you have to sort of be very selective in how you do that, right? You can't tell the entire story of the American Civil War, so you just take a small piece of it and you put it into 140 characters or 280 characters or one image or whatever.
Hmm.
Now, there's literally billions of pieces of internet content that are doing this. And I argue that all of those pieces of content can be categorized as something called e-history. And so what defines a piece of e-history? Well, for me, it's taking some element of the past and condensing it into a media product that can succeed on the social web. But then the key element of it is all e-history, I argue, is also trying to leverage social media in order to achieve visibility,
Hmm.
right? So every piece of content online, including history content, is fighting for visibility in your newsfeed. So ergo, every piece of e-history is also trying to leverage the mechanics of how social media works in order to show up in your newsfeed to achieve visibility, because if it achieves visibility, then it can inform the way you think about the world. So that is what unites all pieces of e-history, and that's what distinguishes it from the forms of history communication that happened in the past, because books were always making arguments, museum exhibits were always making arguments, but they weren't packaging themselves with the express purpose of achieving visibility online. And I argue that when you do that, when you factor in that motivation into the creation of history products, it actually creates a new type of history product that we call e-history, and it comes with it a lot of associated baggage and assumptions and challenges that I talk about in the book.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Gotcha. As I was reading your book, I was thinking about how little I actually know about professional historians. And, I'm very familiar with professional scientists in this space. And as you were explaining that just now, it also made me think of the difference between e-history and maybe professional history is that the views of professional historians aren't in real time conversation with each other, I wouldn't think, um, in the same way that e-history, which is immediate and is present and anyone can access it, has a much more accelerated aspect to it. Am I getting that right?
Well, I would say a couple things. First of all, you're not alone. Most people have no idea what professional historians do. Most people have never even met a professional historian. I spend a lot of time in tech circles and I go to tech conferences, and invariably someone will say to me, "You're the first historian I've ever met," which is sad. And also probably not true because they probably met a history professor at university at one point, or maybe they went on a tour of the Smithsonian at one point and met a professional historian. But they don't even really know what professional historians do. And on some level, that's understandable because I'm not sure I really know what professional plumbers do or professional electricians do or even what professional astrobiologists do, right? We're all sort of in our own little bubbles. But
Hmm.
history does have a sort of opaqueness around it, where people think maybe it's just about recitation of facts about things that happened in the past. But for historians, it's much more interpretive and analytical, and there is an ongoing debate within the field of history all the time about
Hmm.
what the past means and how best to interpret it. And so history as a discipline is sort of this ongoing, ever-changing, always evolving conversation. And that conversation is happening increasingly online as well as offline these days. If you look at Twitter in the past or a Blue Sky today, you will find any number of historians having debates and engaging in professional historical discourse on those platforms in real time, being responsive to current events. So e-history is not exclusive of professional historians. There are professional historians who make very good e-history, There are
Mm.
professional historians who make very bad e-history. E-history is a form of history communication that is made by a lot of different actors, professional historians, journalists, Russian disinformation agents, amateur bloggers. There's a whole range of people who create e-history. One of the questions I ask is why do certain types of e-history seem to achieve more visibility and influence than others? And that becomes a very interesting question because then there's actually an argument to be made, which I make, which is actually that the e-history created by professional historians actually stands less of a chance of visibility than the e-history created by non-professional historians.
Right. So
Mm.
you say in your book, one of my favorite quotes is more historical information online does not translate to greater ease in finding, learning, or understanding that information. It may in fact have the opposite effect. So that seems to be kind of where what we're talking about here is that there's so much information and some of it only rises to the top for very performative reasons. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, this is a phenomenon that every listener is familiar with. You don't know how many conversations you've been in over the past 10 years where someone says, oh, I saw something online, but I can't remember what it was or who said it or what publication it was in, right? I mean, we're all bombarded by so much information every day that that does not lead to clarity. It leads to more confusion. And certainly when I was doing interviews for my book and also researching what's been happening in fields like science and journalism and other places, the research overwhelmingly points to that the more people consume information online, the oftentimes more confused they get about that information.
Yeah, and you
Mhm.
saw that with your students, right?
I've seen it everywhere,
Mm.
anecdotally and in, formal research studies that actually take more sophisticated longitudinal approaches to these things.
Yeah.
So I don't think this should be news to anybody, but it is interesting to think about when it comes to history. Um, you know, just to take one example that I've been sort of privy to lately, there's a lot of discourse right now about how the Holocaust gets represented online.
Mm.
And the
Hmm.
studies and the research that have shown out, that have come out over the past few years are really stunning because in some cases, more than 50% of people in countries surveyed have little to no idea about the Holocaust. They don't know how many Jews were killed during the Holocaust. They can't even name one of the 40,000 concentration camps. Now, you
Mm.
would
Mm.
think with all of this information available online, e-history or not, on all these websites, museum websites, professional websites, Wikipedia, encyclopedias, social media, there's literally hundreds of millions of pieces of content about the Second World War on the internet. How can that be possible? But then you talk to people and you realize that, uh, ultimately, when people are scrolling, first of all, it's so easy to just get into a trance where you're scrolling and scrolling and scrolling, and then you look up 15 minutes later and you have no idea what you looked at. But
Mhm.
secondly, even if you can retain some of what you looked at, the sheer amount of information becomes so confounding and overwhelming that you'll walk away from it a couple days later and realize that you actually have more questions than answers. And
Right.
so this is one of the great paradoxes of e-history, and particularly for professional historians, because professional historians like to think that if only we just put up more accurate information online, that would solve the problem. But actually, there's not a lot of evidence to suggest that that would actually solve the problem.
Right. So one of the more infamous moments in Silicon Valley history having to do with history itself was when Kara Swisher asked Mark Zuckerberg about his take on the Holocaust, since you brought up the Holocaust. And he was ambivalent about whether people should be able to deny it happened or not on his platform. And so you talk about the values of Silicon Valley and internet capitalism, as you call it, and how they've imprinted themselves on how history is slotted in society via these platforms. So, can you talk about some of those values that you see as potentially problematic or affecting how history is presented, consumed, and distributed?
Yeah, I talked to a lot of people in Silicon Valley for this book and since then. And one of the best quotes I got from Silicon Valley Insider was, the internet and the social web is a buffet, not a French restaurant.
Mm.
And um, I actually used that in the book. But when you think about how academic history or peer-reviewed science works, there is so many layers of review before an item actually gets published and introduced into the discourse. And those layers of review can be punishing for sure, but
Hmm.
they're also intended to really hone and refine the argument and to ensure that the statements are credible, that they can be backed up by years of research, that the science or the history underpinning them is sound. If you look at how Silicon Valley, in particular social platforms, have evolved and how they were even formed in the early 2000s, you very quickly realize that they eschew all of these values. They're not interested in peer review. They're not interested in identifying arguments for accuracy. The idea is to be able to empower users to post information as quickly as possible and to spend as much time on the platform as possible, because that incentivizes advertising and it is good for the platform overall, right? If these platforms have no users and no people using them, then they don't have any value. Meta derives its value from the fact that it has 2 billion people using its platforms at any given time around the world, and that those people spend a lot of time on those platforms because that enables them to charge a lot of money for advertising, and that's really how the whole ecosystem works. So there's a very different incentive structure in place when it comes to publishing expert-centric, rigorously researched material versus publishing user-generated content en masse, which has really very few safeguards around it. Over the past 20 to 25 years, we've been having an ongoing debate about the values of each and where the line should be. And my message in the book has never been that user-generated content needs to go away and it's only experts on certain subjects who are allowed to speak. My argument has been that at the same time that we value what these platforms can bring, we also need to make sure we're keeping space in society for what rigorously researched, expert-centric types of knowledge production bring. And I think what has happened over time is that we've way over-indexed and overvalued for the former versus the latter. And so I've argued that we just need more balance in the way that we think about these things. It's certainly entirely appropriate for people to have debates about tough historical subjects or tough scientific subjects on social media platforms. And I don't think that anybody wants to say that that shouldn't be the case. But how do we then still make room in society and privilege and value in society the types of rigorously researched understandings of history and science that have taken, and sometimes generations, to build? And that's one of the last things I will say about Silicon Valley is, when you talk to people in Silicon Valley, there's a real sort of anti-institutional, throw the baby out with the bathwater type of mentality, right? It's just sort of break everything as quickly as possible and then see if you can rebuild it. And I think part of the pushback over the past few years has been to say, well, actually, we shouldn't be breaking everything. There are some things that took many, many years to establish, like vaccine research, for example, vaccine efficacy, for example. And it would be a real shame to society to just eradicate that in the name of user-generated content online.
Right. Right.
One of the things that you just made me think about that we've been talking about recently is the notion of peer review today is not exactly what it always has traditionally involved. And because of the more public debate around experts versus non-experts and alternative ways of thinking, and combine that with the flattening and the open nature of things online and in social media, what has seemed to emerge in outside of academic circles is this notion that peer review is something to decide whether something is correct or incorrect, which it has not traditionally been as binary as that. It's more around the methodology and the validity of the study, but also the audience that this work is intended for. And so something might be appropriate for publication in one journal and not in another. That doesn't mean that it's right or wrong. It's just out of context for the audience. And so I imagine that's a challenge for the professional public crossing that transom as well, is when you get into debates about things, when you're talking about accuracy or inaccuracy in the absence of context for an audience, um, it gets more challenging.
Yeah, and I think there's also, one of the misconceptions about professional history is the assumption that all historians are in classrooms and writing scholarly research articles in academic journals, which is not the case. I mean,
Mhm.
there's a whole wing of the profession that I come from, public history, which is not always interested in peer-reviewed journals, although there are some, but is doing museum exhibitions or doing tours at national park sites or working inside government agencies, either at the state level or at the national level. And those forms of history are just as rigorous, but they entail a very different set of checks and balances.
Mhm.
Whether it be, um, as you say, doing really specific audience research, like in a museum, right? Really understanding who your visitors are and tailoring your exhibition and the exhibition's objectives to that demographic, whether you're targeting older visitors, younger visitors, school groups, etc. Then there's obviously levels of expert review that happen inside the museum space. There are oftentimes advisory committees set up for museum exhibits. I've been on many of them. Um, so that's also, I think, one of the ways that people just don't really understand how diverse the history field is and different ways that history gets practiced. In the United States, invariably, if you tell someone that you're a professional historian, they immediately think, oh, you're a university professor teaching inside of a classroom. But
Mhm.
there's tens of thousands of historians who are professionals who are not doing that. Um, so even just making the analogy between history and science is tricky in that regard. Also, my sense, and again, not being fully familiar with how the scientific enterprise works, my sense with science is that the real gold standard are journal articles, right? Whereas in history, the real gold standard are historical monographs, most of the time
Mhm.
single author monographs, right? If you
Mhm.
look at what historians professional in the professorial ranks are writing, they're almost invariably writing single author monographs first and foremost, and the articles that they write in journals either are derived from those or are part of the research that's ultimately leading to a book, or maybe are part of a broader oeuvre or part of a broader corpus that includes a number of books. Um,
Mhm.
and so the premium on the history book as an artifact is also something that history has to grapple with because invariably, as we know today, people are not reading 400-page history books, really very,
Right.
very rarely anyway. So
Right.
then how do you take that sort of gold standard of history publication in that wing of the profession and translate it into something that works as e-history? That's a difficult challenge.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a second. I think one of the things that you said, though, I think there's more of an analog than maybe you realize that in the sciences, and we grapple with this all the time. There's a very low percentage of scientists actually produce research papers. Most scientists are practicing physicians or engineers or whatever, microbiologists, whatever. So the again there's a caricature in of scientific processes where it's all about papers, it's all about this or that, research topics, peer review, and all of that. But it's a hugely practitioner driven area, and that's why the audience relevance we think is that's it seems like an analog to like a misapprehension on a grander scale about how history works or humanities work, how science works. There's tons of most people are working in those fields and are just professionals in those fields trying to keep up and stay current and do the best job they can. One of our favorite statements in your book is that historians consider history to be intrinsically valuable. So, can you talk a little bit about that? Just because we're big fans of that phrase.
Yeah, so at one point when I was writing the book, I had this chart on my wall where I was
Mm,
trying to decipher the sort of underpinning values of how social media and the web operate versus the values that underpin how professional history operates. And I went back and read a fair number of books and articles from historians over decades about why study history in the first place. And there's a huge corpus of literature around this question. Historians spend a lot of time communicating about why their profession should be necessary for all people to engage with. And and it emerged from doing that reading that there was a real pattern, which was essentially that the argument historians had been making for decades was that history was valuable because history was valuable. I mean, essentially, it was kind of like a circular, it was like an Ouroboros in some ways. It was a
Right,
circular
right.
argument, but basically the idea was it's just something valuable that people need in order to function in their everyday life. And so, hence, it's valuable for you to engage with it and support us in our endeavor of doing it.
Mhm.
Right.
Um,
It puts your life in context in a
right.
way,
I mean, there's
in a
all kinds of
big
ways
way.
that that gets spun, right? History makes you a better citizen. It makes you a better participant in democracy. It helps you
Right.
understand your own family or your own journey. And, there's lots of ways to sort of then take that argument and then splice it out into more directly applicable context. But it all sort of comes back to this idea that history is just sort of valuable as a thing that needs to be valued.
Hmm.
And I thought that stood in real contrast to the way social media and the social web have evolved, which is essentially that, things are valuable because they have lots of views and clicks and shares, right? If you and I post the exact same video online with the exact same content, but yours gets 10 million views and mine gets 10 views, yours is more valuable because it has 10 million
Right.
views, even though the
Mhm.
content is exactly the same. So
Yeah.
there's this very much like this extrinsically valuable metrics are built into how the web has been architectured and evolved, and the sort of
Hmm.
credence that we give as society to content on the web. We pay more attention. Advertisers are willing to pay more dollars. People are willing to pay you to do more speaking gigs if you have 10 million versus 10. And so
Yeah.
that seemed to me a big difference between the two like fundamental values underpinning how these ecosystems work. And what I was thinking about, and what I honestly have been thinking about ever since I wrote the book, is how historians try to take these sort of values about these arguments about intrinsic value and integrate them into an ecosystem that really doesn't have any intrinsic value. I mean, like
Yeah.
nothing on the web has any intrinsic value, right? It's all disposable. You
Hmm.
create the content, the next day you've forgotten you've created it, right? You're creating
Mhm.
Yeah.
tens of millions of videos at any given time on these platforms. So it's all kind of disposable and doesn't really have any intrinsic value to it unless it can garner attention and virality, and then it starts to become more valuable. So how do you transpose one value system into another when the incentives are so misaligned? I think this is something that historians are still struggling with, and I think all expert-centric disciplines, in fact, are probably struggling with this.
Mm.
Yeah, it's interesting to reflect on how, like, so I run an e-newsletter and have been doing that in a blog for years. And one of the things I'm very disciplined about is putting links into source materials, right? It's my citation pattern, my citation approach. And in writing the book, that really helped us because it became this historical document in a sense of everything that had been happening over the last 20 years or so. But those links, a lot of them were broken. A lot of them, even on the Wayback Machine, were hard to find. And but the whole idea of hypertext linking was about making sure you had a view into something in the past, right? Something this was published, this was said, and you can link back to it. And now even that part of the web seems to be being swept away. So it's ephemeral and it's a problem. And I'm sure there are, like you, historians really struggling with that. So one of the things I wanted to get on some more difficult terrain, if we can. So we talk a lot about all of these things and how they're manifesting themselves, but it seems like there's a path from e-history, at least they're concurrently happening, where there's this e-history, the social media domination, and a rise of American fascism. Are they just coincidental, or do you see them as being somehow related?
Well, it's a complex question, and I don't know if I have a definitive answer for you at the moment. I think one of the things that happened after I wrote the book was even before the book, when I was director of the LePage Center, I had started doing some speaking engagements with the US Department of State. And they had sent me to Lithuania and they had sent me to France. And I had talked about disinformation and particularly disinformation about history and how it circulates online. But then, as we all know, my book came out in January of 2022, and in February of 2022, Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And it wasn't long after that that the State Department came back to me and they said, we see that you've now written a book about this topic. Um, Disinformation about history has obviously been central to the Russian aggression against Ukraine, because the Russian war in Ukraine is not just about land and about territory, but it's about identity, and it's about
Right.
erasing basically the history of the Ukrainian people and subsuming it into a broader narrative of Russian historical influence, both
Mm-hmm.
as an empire and as the Soviet Union, and now in the resurgence of empire that Putin is trying to imagine for himself.
Mm-hmm.
So I began working with the State Department very closely and worked with them very closely in both 2023 and 2024, and went all across Eastern Europe talking about the book and its applications to not just the war in Ukraine, but to how autocrats and authoritarians leverage social media in order to spread and propagate historical disinformation, and
Right.
why that
Propaganda
works
machines.
and why it works so effectively as it does.
Mm-hmm.
Um, one of the arguments that I made actually was very much premised around Facebook and Meta, and that was that if you go back and look, as I did in the book, at how the Facebook newsfeed has evolved, what I found was that the Facebook newsfeed over time was purposefully built and designed to privilege nostalgia,
Mm.
and particularly like nostalgic photographs, right, which would take up these wide spaces inside your newsfeed.
Yep.
And if you
Mm.
think back to your own experience on Facebook, this will ring a bell because you see all kinds of on this day posts or old
Yeah.
historic photos in your
Your
newsfeed.
memories.
Right. So that was all purposefully built over time as a way to keep people engaged with the feed. But
Mm-hmm.
what's interesting with that is that if you marry that with an authoritarian regime that traffics in nostalgia about the past, it creates a very potent combination. And if you
Yeah.
look in places like Georgia, for example, not US Georgia, but the Caucasus Georgia,
Mm-hmm.
if you look at the Balkans, in places like Kosovo and in North Macedonia and Bulgaria and Romania, all across that region, what you find is this proliferation of nostalgic content for the former Soviet Union, for the former Russian Empire, all across people's Facebook feeds. And Facebook, in countries like Georgia, for example, is basically the principal way that people access the social web, especially on their mobile
Mm-hmm.
devices. So I began to make the argument that there is actually a link there. It may not be explicit, it may not even be intended or purposeful, but if you
Right.
marry a platform that privileges nostalgic content and has so much penetration inside of a population with authoritarian characteristics and leaders who know how to weaponize that nostalgia into a yearning for empire, or a turning away from democracy and back to the good old days of when you could, do X, Y, Z.
Right.
One of the things I heard when I was in the Balkans was, man, wasn't the Tito dictatorship great because the jeans were cheaper and you could take chips to Italy with your family and afford it, right? I mean, there's all kinds of ways
Yeah.
that these
Right.
longings for empire and authoritarianism get woven into the sort of everyday fabric of life,
Hmm.
but they
Yep.
all manifest on Facebook,
Yep.
at least in that region. So there is definitely a link between what the platforms privilege and the types of information and historical content, e-history, that certain world leaders have become very adept at propagating and manipulating.
Mm-hmm.
So
That's
that
fantastic.
it doesn't have to just be disinformation or misinformation. It can also be the um, co-opting historical moments or images to incite some kind of reaction from the public that you want to get from them. Is that right as well?
Well, I think the toolkit has gotten very sophisticated. I mean, this is now 10 to 15 years of this phenomenon en masse across the world. And if you look at, to keep on Russia example, I mean, the estimates are, that I've seen, anywhere from $1 billion to $2 billion per year that Russia spends on information warfare. So
Mm-hmm.
when you're making that type of investment for 7 days a week, 24 hours a day for 15 years, you're going to be very sophisticated at it, and you're going to pull a lot of tricks. out of your
Mm-hmm.
bag.
Yeah.
And so the narratives are multifaceted. They span different countries and different languages. You know, the way it's targeted in Estonia and Lithuania is different than the way it's targeted in Serbia and Croatia. Um, the languages are unique, the narratives are unique, the historical examples are unique, you know, whether it's buying jeans in Italy during the Tito era or a yearning for the camaraderie of knowing your neighbor during the East German period, which is also
Mm-hmm.
something that I heard when I was in East Germany. So it comes up in different ways and in different manifestations, but it does all rely on a sort of, you know, distorted understanding of the past that
Hmm.
presents itself as an honest historical analysis. And it leverages e-history, right? It uses e-history because e-history is purposely designed to become visible on social media. So you use that visibility to get this in front of people's faces and ultimately try to sway them, you know, away from one way and towards another way.
Yeah. All right. So one other thing you talked about, we talked about a little bit earlier, you touched on it, is how professional historians have to get themselves into the flow, right? Have to engage and get professional historical perspectives into, this media space, even though it makes it a little bit difficult. Is there anybody who's doing that really well, do you think, right now?
Yeah, I mean, Heather Cox Richardson's probably the primary example. She began on Facebook with these um, you know, basically short essays slash long letters, depending on which word you use, um,
Hmm.
during the first Trump administration, I think. And she has parlayed that into a massive internet following. Her Substack, I think, has over 1 million subscribers. She's one of the largest Substacks on the entire platform, not just professional historians.
Right.
Hmm.
Um, I know Heather a little bit. We had her at the LePage Center for an event. She's very smart and she's a good historian. It's not as if what Heather knows about history is so much different from what other historians know about history. It's just that she's really skilled and adept at understanding the information ecosystem and how to work within it.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
And so she's done an amazing job of bringing historical analysis to the masses through the various platforms that are available to us. There are others out there who've done really good work too. Um, but it's hard, and part of the reason it's hard is again because the value systems are misaligned, and so the way historians are trained professionally is oftentimes at odds with what is required to be successful on social media. But also, there are just very real time and resource constraints. I mean, if you're working inside a Smithsonian museum and you have to curate exhibits and do research and manage artifacts and give public tours and attend meetings and do your time in attendance and all the other things that come with being in a full-time position, you don't really have a lot of time, nor are you paid extra to create a really compelling web series about a historical subject,
Right.
unless you want to just do that on your own free time when you get home at night, which most people can't do. The same
Right.
inside academia. If
Hmm.
you're teaching 3 classes with X numbers of students and grading papers and designing exams, and you're also forced to um, publish or perish, whether it be books or articles, and you have to review tenure applications, and you have to sit on academic committees, and you have to do all the other stuff that comes with being a history professor, then again, the time and resources available to devote to creating web content every day that you don't get compensated for, it just becomes a very heavy lift. So
Hmm.
I
It's
think there are
interesting or you're making me think is that these, and maybe it's just too simple to really even state it, but these platforms privilege people with time on their hands.
Well, I think what we've seen is that these platforms have become very professionalized.
Yeah.
Being a internet creator is actually a job now. I mean, there are people who make 5 to 6 figures, sometimes 7 figures,
Yeah.
and that's what they do. They post content 3 times per day on a various platform. They are strategic about it. They have scripts, they have collaborators, they have professional equipment, and that's sort of what it takes now. I mean, in maybe 10, 15 years ago, you could put a couple of videos up on YouTube and hope for serendipity. But these days, the landscape has gotten very
Oh,
professionalized.
there's definitely coordinated action too.
There's a lot of money behind it too.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Influencers are getting brand deals, and those brand deals dictate when they post and how often they post and what they post about. So to thrive successfully in that profession, which is what it is right now, requires the same level of time, attention, and resources and commitment that it requires to thrive in other professions. And it's hard to
Mm-hmm.
do two professions at once. So if you're a professional historian teaching at a university, are you also going to be a professional content creator online? That's a heavy lift for most people.
Right. And very few are going to burn the boats and do that. Yeah, absolutely. Joy, any other questions for Jason? This has been great.
Well, with what you just said, how do you what tell us about your day job?
Um, well, I mean, I set out a couple years ago to see if I could do this, if I could try to speak publicly and write publicly about the way that technology is shaping not only what we know about history, but what we know about other expert-centric disciplines like journalism, like government, for example, which for a long time
Hmm.
has been expert-centric, at least in the United States and Europe, um, and diplomacy,
Mm.
and help us navigate through these changes to get to the other side to someplace better. Um, I've been fortunate to be able to do that for the past couple of years. As mentioned, a lot of work with the State Department, work with some other people, a lot of efforts inside the responsible tech world. But to be honest, in 2025, I'm feeling a bit disheartened about where that all has,
Mm.
what that all has added up to. I just think that the scale of the challenges that we face are so massive that even with communities of really smart, dedicated people working tirelessly, um, there are just some really big, powerful forces that we're pushing against that are making uh, positive change really difficult. There has been incremental change. If you look at the field of responsible tech, for example, that field didn't
Hmm.
really exist a few years ago. And now there is a field of people who recognize that they need to work in tech in order to have jobs that pay bills, but want to bring some level of ethics and integrity to that work where it's not solely harmful and destructive. And so
Right.
that's a positive thing. And if you look at the
Hmm.
field of professional history, it's not just Heather Cox Richardson, but there are other efforts that have tried to bridge the gap between public consumption of e-history and the academic or public history professional class that creates history on a regular basis. And so there have been incremental improvements, but we're really, I've written about this in my own newsletter. I feel like we're sort of staring down three massive existential crises at the same time, a technological crisis, a political crisis, and an environmental crisis.
Mm.
And all three of them are connected, but because they're interconnected, the actually finding some solutions to any of them is proving extremely difficult. And I
Hmm.
worry whether we will actually find any solutions before it's too late. So that is now one of the things that has preoccupied my thoughts in the most recent day to day.
Yeah,
How to
we've been talking
accelerate.
about that too. The issue for us, the connective tissue for us, and we're making promises to get to this, and we still have to
Hmm.
do it. Joy is to talk about. We think it's a governance crisis. All three of those are caused by a crisis in good governance at multiple levels, and if and so that's you know love your thoughts on that, but that's kind of where we're thinking there's a connect. There's if you had good governance, you wouldn't have those things, actually. Good tech governance, good environmental governance, and so on.
Hmm. And our goal in our little corner of, scientific publishing part of this ecosystem is to learn what we can, and look around us, get our heads out of our own bubble and see what we can learn from folks like you and other disciplines to see where we can um, apply some new or evolving forms of governance to protect what we can control now that so much is uncontrollable.
Yeah, yeah. So are you working on just say to everybody, read his book. It's fantastic. It's short. It's very tightly written. It's an excellent read, and I
Mhm.
really enjoyed it thoroughly. Also, his newsletter. We'll put links in the podcast. Are you working on another book? Is that in the cards?
I have a book on artificial intelligence that I would like to write.
Mm,
I have some preliminary structures in place, chapters, some text in those chapters. So we'll see. We'll see if that becomes a reality. There's some other things that I'm looking at doing, which might get more to that governance question that you're talking about.
oh, terrific.
Um, but it's I think one of the challenges right now is everybody's trying to figure out exactly what to do.
Mm,
And I think part of what I feel like I have to do is I have to at least be vocal about what I'm seeing and speak about it candidly, um, in a way that people can understand. And so that's what I try to do with my public talks and with my newsletter.
Mhm.
And I feel like probably the newsletter will become a bigger piece of the flywheel
hmm.
very soon in service to that mission. Um, but we we need to act soon on all these things.
Yeah.
Probably yesterday, but at the very least tomorrow.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
I think if we can find ways for historians and scientists and journalists and others to collaborate more fruitfully and more expediently, that would be really beneficial.
Yeah, but it's interesting too. I just want to make one last little distinction because we talk of, experts have been demonized, but I think professionals are where it's at. And my encounters with professional historians have been that they are shockingly informed compared to me about history. And I think if people don't look at professionals, if they don't, if they want to know something, talk to a professional about it because that's a
Mhm.
word that doesn't trigger anybody. But like you said, if you're a professional plumber, you're a professional historian, you're a professional, person who takes care of babies, kid doctor,
So you're
that's,
saying use professional is not as polarizing as expert.
yeah, yeah. Everybody wants to think of themselves as a professional at some level, right? So I was just a rhetorical um, pitch. But anyhow, go ahead, Jason.
Oh, I don't have anything more to add. I think you guys are on your way to being professional podcasters. So that's
Oh,
we can
there you
certainly
go.
look to you for podcasting advice in the future.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Well, thanks to Jason for being with us. I'll put links to his newsletter, his book, recommend it to him. And I hope we're in touch again before too long. It's been fantastic. And I know that we have people in common in our lives, and I know they're going to love watching this. So
Great.
thanks, Jason.
Thank you guys. Appreciate it.
Well, that was awesome. Thanks again to Jason for joining us. And we were really excited that he agreed to talk with us. We had a whole bunch of questions, and he really put up with us
He's a very nice
really
guy.
well. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We could have kept him
Class
here
act.
for another hour or so. I had so many little things that I picked out of the book that I wanted to get a little bit more scoop on. But that was really good. So again, we recommend that to everyone. I got it from my local library. I think did you get yours from the library
Yeah, but
too?
I then purchased it because,
Hmm.
money in the pocket to the authors, people. So, we recommend the book. There'll be a link to it and also to his newsletter in the podcast notes and all that. So show
Hmm.
notes, as they say. I've got to start getting more
Yeah,
hip to
link,
this game.
you got to smash the like and subscribe link below. And either buy the book or check it out from your library and
Or both,
definitely,
like me.
or both, like Kent, and leave a review for him on Amazon or Barnes and Noble or wherever you get your book.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so let's do discoveries of the week.
Yeah, I'll go first this time. And this is funny. You did the post of the things that we've been texting about this week, and one of
Right.
them was that article. I think it was a Financial Times about Sam
Oh,
Altman and his kitchen. And if you guys haven't read that, you
That was
really
so
should.
funny.
It was so
Uh,
good. It also hit really, really close to home because I knew exactly what they were talking about with all of the things that they were talking about. And so
mm,
in particular, my discovery of the week is the Grassa olive oil that Sam Altman was using so wrongly, that it just undermines his, credibility on
on
anything,
multiple fronts.
on
Yeah.
multiple fronts. But anyway, it's this new line of olive oil, and it was one where it's like positioned at the counter next to the fancy deli and things like that. And it's like I try to resist the packaging, but finally I was like, I gotta try it. And dang, it's so good. It is so
Mm,
good. And
especially the fresh one, I bet.
yeah, so you got a drizzle, a sizzle, and a frizzle are the
Hmm.
three different kinds, which is
It is good
basically,
packaging.
yeah, it's good packaging, it's good labeling.
Yeah.
And so if you get tempted by that good packaging, I highly recommend it.
So
Um,
as I remember right, the drizzle is the youngest one, so it has the more flavor.
yeah, that's it. That's the fresh. That you just
It's
add a
the
little
fresh.
bit, you taste it, you could
Mm,
eat it with a spoon. And that ding
mm.
dong was frying something with it.
Yeah, and the smoke point's wrong.
All of it was wrong.
Such a knucklehead.
And you know what? I wasn't gonna get the cooking one, but then
Hmm.
I looked, I did a price comparison with, the store brand. It was the
Right.
same. So you
Yeah.
know what? I'm sticking
Yeah.
with it.
Live a little, right? Live a little.
What did you discover this week?
Mine's also food related, and I'm ashamed that it took this long because it comes from Ohio. My wife went back to visit her mom, and I think she's a little chagrined that it took her this long to realize this was happening. And maybe it took her mom this long to realize this was a possibility. But we love sweet corn. We love sweet corn season. We love like just eating it without butter. Just it's so good and delicious. But it's, you have to shuck it, you have to get the silk off of it, and you have to, steam it or boil it or grill it or both or whatever. And so she went back to Ohio, and her mom took an ear of corn with the husks on and just put it in the microwave for 4 minutes.
The whole
And
thing
the whole thing, just exactly like
with
you'd
all the
wrap
little
it,
hairs in there too.
everything on it. Yeah, everything on it. Yeah, all the silk's on it, all the leaves are on it still, the husks. And then you take it out with an oven mitt or a towel or whatever. And then you just cut off the bottom, like just a little bit, just enough.
Mhm.
And then you take the tassels and you just shake it. And the corn just
Ah,
falls right out, hardly any silk on it. In our case, the two that we had from the local farm, there was zero silk on it. And then it's super hot. The thing is that the cob inside has also heated up a lot, so it's super hot. So you have to let it cool, but that's
yeah,
it. And then you just can eat it, and it's like that is genius. So that was my discovery of the week: is microwave your
just the
sweet
whole
corn and
thing.
just cut off the bottom, shake the tassel, everything it just drops out, and then you just have, and then it's neat to throw away too. You don't have the flying corn silk all over your hands and all over the counter that you can't find until 2 days later, and you're like, "Ooh, what's all this dry spider web stuff?" Oh, it's the corn silk. So yeah,
That's a good idea. It's like a tamale already
it is.
by
It
nature. It's
is.
nature's tamale, perfectly packaged. Holy crap, you just blew my mind, Kent. Thanks.
See, that's why it's discovery of the week. All right, so I'm gonna take us out. So thanks for tuning in. Thanks to our friends at Provoke the Truth for the music, and as always, let us know what you think. We do have more interviews lined up. If you have recommendations for us about who you might want us to talk with, send us an email at disruptedscience@gmail.com. And do we have a historical? I wish I had one of those car horns for like the silly sign off on the week, the Aruga horns. That would be a good historical one. I don't know. I was thinking huzzah is a favorite historical exclamation. You want to do
Or we could
huzzah?
just say that's all, folks.
There you go. That's all, folks.